China is gaining more and more power over Russia, and Putin will lose the far east of the country if he doesn't change his strategy soon. And the interesting thing is that Beijing doesn't need to conquer Russia militarily. It will be enough for them to wait while Eastern Russia loses population, young people, and becomes increasingly difficult to control. I've noticed that many of you watch my videos, and I'm really happy about that, but you're not subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. It's free for you, but it's really vital for the channel. Thank you very much. The Russian Far East is a region rich in natural resources and strategically important because it faces China, North Korea, Japan, and the Pacific. And consider that the Far Eastern Federal District is the largest in the Russian Federation and covers about 40% of the territory, but on the other hand, it has less than 8 million inhabitants, which is just over 5% of the country's population. And this fragility is nothing new. In fact, during the Soviet Union, Moscow populated these areas by sending workers, offering higher salaries, housing, and incentives. But then the Soviet Union collapsed. At that point, many people started to consider whether it was worth staying in a cold, remote place with fewer services compared to Moscow or St. Petersburg. From there, the demographic decline became structural. Since 1990, the Russian Far East has actually lost about a quarter of its population, and the number of residents has decreased by more than 10% since Putin came to power in 2000, and it could drop by another 8% by the end of this decade. And keep in mind, when a region loses population, it's not just something you see on charts because it loses doctors, teachers, students, and workers in general. And when people leave, services get worse as a result because there are fewer local taxes being paid. And if services get worse, more people will decide to leave, and even fewer people will pay taxes. It's a vicious cycle, and Moscow knows this very well. Putin himself has pointed to the demographic decline of the Russian Far East as a threat to national security. And in fact, over the years, the Kremlin has tried to revive the region with many programs. Tax breaks, subsidies, low-interest mortgages, and also the Far East Hectare program. That is free land for those willing to move there. But free land is not enough. Because if they give you a plot of land in an area where there are no roads, jobs, or services, that land isn't really an opportunity, but just a piece of land that's hard to make use of. In fact, more than 150,000 people have received land through this program, but many plots have remained unused precisely because of a lack of infrastructure, unfavorable climate, and bureaucratic obstacles. And here you can see the limit of the Russian strategy. Moscow can announce big plans and say that the Far East is important for Russia. But then, to bring a region to life, you need money, infrastructure, and businesses. And these things are not easy to create. After the large-scale conflict in Ukraine began, the problem worsened. Russia must allocate increasing resources to its military industry, support its economy under sanctions, and hold its own against the West. And this means that there are far fewer resources left to develop the peripheral regions. And keep in mind, because the Russian Far East still depends heavily on federal funding. Just think that in 2014, over 73 billion rubles were allocated for infrastructure and economic initiatives in the region. But the problem is that many projects remain fragile, slow, or too dependent on external sources. Also because the war absorbs a huge amount of resources, and this is where China comes into play. After 2022, in fact, Russia lost a huge part of its economic relations with the West. Sanctions, the exit of many Western companies, and the energy split with Europe forced Moscow to look for new opportunities. And the new main opportunity has become Beijing. Today, China buys investments. In fact, it buys Russian energy, sells industrial products to Russia, and provides technologies, machinery, and consumer goods. And above all, Beijing is becoming increasingly important in allowing Russia to avoid economic collapse. During Vladimir Putin's recent visit to Beijing, the two countries marked their strategic partnership by signing over 40 cooperation agreements in trade, technology, and media. Nearly all trade payments between Russia and China, worth about $240 billion, are now made in yuan and rubles to counter Western sanctions. However, caution is advised. In Chinese yuan and rubles precisely to counter Western sanctions. Now, at first glance, this might seem like a Russian victory because the Kremlin's reasoning is the West sanctions us, so we shift toward Asia. And while this makes sense on one hand, on the other, this eastward shift risks making Russia very dependent on China. And that's because the relationship is not balanced. In fact, Russia mainly sells raw materials like oil and gas. China, on the other hand, sells industrial products such as cars, machinery, and high value-added goods. Basically, Russia exports resources while China exports industry. And this difference matters because a country that sells raw materials depends a lot on the price of those materials, on global demand, and on the bargaining power of the two countries involved. And usually a country that sells industry, technology, and finished products has a stronger position, not to mention the fact that Moscow can now sell its raw materials almost only to China. In fact, in 2024, China already accounted for 33.8% of Russia's total trade, with bilateral exchanges worth $244 billion. However, Russian exports to China were mainly dominated by energy resources. And China buys almost 30% of Russian exports, while only about 3% of Chinese exports go to Russia. This matters because for Russia, China is essential, but for China, Russia is useful, not vital. Beijing negotiates from a position of strength. Take gas, for example. Russia already supplies gas to China through the Power of Siberia pipeline. It became operational in 2019 with a capacity of 38 billion cubic meters per year. Also, building a Far Eastern route to deliver Russian gas to China is progressing. And exports are expected to start in 2027 with 2 billion cubic meters per year, then increase up to 12 billion. And on paper, this seems like a great energy integration. That's true. But in practice, it also means that Russia is building more and more infrastructure aimed at a single major customer, which is China. Building costly infrastructure for a single customer gives that customer leverage, since they know you need to sell. The Power of Siberia is the clearest example. That's true. The pipeline that is supposed to bring gas from Western Siberia to China. In fact, Moscow presents it as a strategic success. But the project is actually full of uncertainties. Putin admitted China will pay less for Russian gas than Europe, and the project likely won't be operational before 2030. And this tells us that Russia has lost Europe as a major energy customer, perhaps for good, and now it is therefore turning to China. But China knows it can wait, negotiate, and impose better conditions, and in fact that's exactly what it's doing, and the agreement has not yet been finalized. So even here, it's not China gaining power over Russia through military actions, but by waiting for Russia to have fewer and fewer alternatives. And this dependence is already visible in many sectors. After the invasion of Ukraine, in fact, many Western companies left the Russian market, and China filled that space. In the automotive sector, for example, between 2021 and 2024, the share of Chinese brands in the Russian market went from 7% to almost 60%. In 2024, China sold more than 1 million vehicles to Russia. It's a real economic replacement. And since this replacement involves energy, technology, cars, and components, it's not just trade, it's power. Also because today Russia can turn almost exclusively to China to replace many of the economic relationships it previously had with the West and especially with Europe. And the Russian Far East is the place where this process becomes most evident, because if you live there, China isn't a distant partner, but it's the closest market, it's the nearest source of goods. And it's the most dynamic economic center in the region, so if Moscow can't connect the Far East well to the rest of the country, then it's normal for that region to look more and more toward China. Not because someone officially decides it, but because the economy follows the simplest path. And the simplest path for many areas of the Russian Far East leads toward China and not toward Moscow. And this is the central geopolitical point, that is, real control doesn't just come from the flag, but from whoever keeps things running. And so, if a region remains formally Russian, but economically depends more and more on China, then real control and therefore sovereignty becomes ambiguous. And to all this, we now have to add a historical element, which they remember very well in Beijing. In fact, a part of the Russian Far East in the past was within the orbit of the Qing Empire and passed to Russia in the 19th century. At a time when China was greatly weakened after the Opium Wars and was under strong pressure from powers like the United Kingdom, France, and Russia itself. And in Chinese historical memory, those territories are linked to the era of the so-called unequal treaties. That is, agreements signed when China was too weak to oppose the demands of the great foreign powers. Now, this certainly doesn't mean that China wants to invade those territories, but it does add a historical paradox. Territories that the Russian Empire conquered when China was weak are now next to a much stronger China, while Russia, on the other hand, is much weaker. Here you see why the Ukraine war is backfiring on Putin. Russia aimed to be an empire again, but the conflict is having the opposite effect. More isolation, more dependence on China, less ability to develop the internal regions, and more demographic fragility. And so, the Russia that wanted to become great again risks instead becoming the junior partner of Beijing. Then, of course, you can still have nuclear weapons, a huge army, and great power rhetoric, but economically you are dependent, and when you are dependent, you also have to accept things you don't really like. And the Russian Far East today is the big test, because in 30 or 50 years, who will really control this region? So, in 30 or 50 years, who will really control the Russian Far East? Be careful, not necessarily in terms of borders, because on the map it will probably still be Russia, but in terms of the economy, trade flows, investments, infrastructure, and labor. Because if the Russian population keeps declining, if young people keep leaving, and if Moscow continues not to build enough infrastructure, and above all, if China increasingly becomes the main economic reference point for the region, then the answer to this question is no longer so obvious. And maybe, formally, it will be Russia, but economically China. And do you think Russia really risks becoming too dependent on China? Let me know in the comments, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy my videos. Bye.